I'm Mark Gilbert here. In this video, we're going to explore the intersection between the actions of channeling and the New Thought philosophy. Now, before we delve into that, I want to give a little bit of my personal background in terms of interacting with channeling and channelers. My first experience really was reading some of the Seth books back in the 1970s or 1980s, where it was clearly labeled as information that was coming from channeled sources. From that coming forward, I think the next interaction I really had was listening to the Abraham Hicks material. Again, channeled material coming through Esther Hicks in the form of somebody or something called Abraham. And I really resonated with that particular material. And so when I had the opportunity through Friends in New Thought to go to some channeling sessions, I easily opted into it and then started attending and visited with several different channelers over the years. Many sessions going to them, and have a lot of opinions and thoughts regarding, the information that I've gleaned through those particular channeling sessions. But I've got to admit that as the more I got involved in and was understanding channeling, the more I looked back on things that I had encountered previously in my spiritual exploration, and things that were not necessarily labeled channeling, which I've come to believe that really were. Probably most prevalent was the Edgar Cayce material. That was something that I was very much fascinated, even as a teenager, reading Edgar Cayce books and about his readings. But it's only in retrospect that I realized from the descriptions of Edgar Cayce going into this trance on a bed and answering questions, that it's very similar in the same sort of idea as channeling. Also, the book A Course in Miracles, the way it's described and how it was received, is obviously channeled information. And it's also made me go back and look at other sources of other material, such as a lot of the writings back in the early part of the 20th century, people like Alice Bailey, maybe even going back further and looking at Madame Blavatsky. There was a whole period of time where a lot of humans liked to reference that they were getting these teachings or material from what they called ascended masters. And when I first encountered that, I was really picturing a physical person who sort of materialized into the room, answered questions for the individual, shared that information with them, and then sort of disappeared. And my logical, rational mind wanted to say, well, couldn't they just, get a hold of that person and show them to people and let them see there really is this ascended master that's giving them the information? But in so many cases, these ascended masters were held back from the public view. And as I read that and think about it now, I have no doubt that that information that perhaps Blavatsky was getting, and certainly Alice Bailey, obviously was coming through them through some higher source. So I've tended to sort of change my thinking about how channeled material can show up. Now, I find that most people in New Thought are open to the idea of channeled information, partly because New Thought teaches that we are in multiple realms at one time, something we'll get into in a moment. And so that when we look at material or information coming to us from other dimensions or other realms, that's very much in alignment with what New Thought teaches in terms of the ability to tap into intuition and sources of information that transcend the physical. So I find that a lot of people in New Thought are very open to it. A lot of New Thought communities, not necessarily will they bring channeled information in specifically to their communities. There may be a little bit of a stigma about that, especially in some communities, and I think a lot of that depends on the leadership and the minister in that particular community and how open they are to that particular idea. Now, it probably is worthwhile in this moment to stop and say, what is channeling, and make a distinction, because a lot of times people will understand channeling and is sort of what we might consider trance channeling. And so when I've been using the word channeling up to this point in this video, I really am referencing trance channeling. Now, what is that? And the experience really is that somebody who is a channeler sits and goes into sort of a meditative state and sort of allows some other entity to enter into their body and to communicate through their physical body. Now, I don't know what you feel about those, and I've got a lot of feelings one way or the other about that, but I've tended to let go of that aspect of it and recognize that sometimes the information that's coming through the person, if they choose to want to label it as coming from ascended masters or from extraterrestrials or from people on Pleiades, or if it's some consortium of non-material beings who come together to group information to be channeled through a particular person. However they choose to see that, and then that allows us to have judgments about it, and sometimes that can take away from our listening to the message. And because we're thinking, is this a bunch of BS that that ETs are speaking through this person who's in front of me or who's on this YouTube video? And I think that if we simply stop and let our judgments stop us from even evaluating the information based on our sense that how they tend to label the source of where it's coming from, tends to limit our access to possibly what could be useful information from that particular source. So if you're like me, when I first was going to channeling sessions, I had a little bit of resistance to their description of where this information was coming from. And of course, in my rational materialistic mind, I wanted to know, where is this info coming from? And I have an idea on that, which we're going to be exploring as we move on through this particular video. But my word to you is to be open, no matter how they say what the source is to be open to the message and then to apply discernment to it. I see some people who, it came from a channeled source, and so they either totally negate it and say it's not of any value. And I see other people who totally accept it 100%, and it's coming from some channeled source, so it's got to be true. And what I tend to do is take a middle ground on it and say, I have my own rational thought. I have my own intuitive knowing about what's true and what's not true. And through the tools of both rational thinking and intuitive knowing, I can apply discernment to the information that I'm being given. I can weigh it against what my mindset has been towards how the world works and how I think things are. I can look at it and say, does it have any value for me? And can I absorb it into my current worldview and use it? Does it give me any good message that's applicable in my life? I can do that. Or I can say, this doesn't hold the sense of truth for me, and to discount it. And I encourage you, when you listen in to any information that's coming from channeled sources, to apply discernment. Decide whether it's right for you or not right for you. So as I let go of my preconceived judgments towards any kind of source where this material is coming from, I tend to plug into that sort of a placeholder that says this information is coming from higher mind, it's coming from non-material sources, and that it can be the collective consciousness, or it can be the upper realms of consciousness, it can be spirit, it can be in the collective consciousness of humanity. Hence, I think that if you use those kinds of labels for it rather than ETs and ascended masters and all that other stuff, it maybe is an easy on-ramp for you to opening yourself to listening to the messages. Now, if you're in New Thought and you've never experienced anyone doing trance channeling and you're curious about it based on this video, I would encourage you to maybe check out some YouTube videos of individuals. I'll give you a couple. One is Abraham Hicks. I'll leave a link in the show description below. I think that her teachings are very much in alignment with New Thought and Science of Mind, and you'll find that her message is very comfortable to you. More recently, I've discovered the work of Bashar. Bashar is the channeled name of some channeling done by an individual by the name of Daryl Anka. I'll leave a link in the show description as well for him. I am finding a lot of his teachings are very much in alignment with the Science of Mind as well. And I encourage you to check those out if you've never experienced a channeling session, or even if you have, you may find them interesting. Now, at this point, I want to do a little aside and tell you about the work of a woman by the name of Dr. Helane Wahbeh, who is a researcher with the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And she wrote a book a few years ago called The Science of Channeling. And there's a link in the show description if you're interested in the book. But she writes in this book about channeling and expands the concept of what it is beyond what we normally think, and that is what I described a few moments ago as trance channeling. She sees trance channeling as just one aspect of a spectrum of channeling, where on one end of the spectrum are things like gut hunches, just that sense of knowing, that intuition, those feelings that we get, where some sort of information comes to us and we don't know its particular source. And so that's one end of the spectrum. And then as she moves up, she says somewhere in the middle are all of the ESP experiences that we know and read about, like telepathy or telekinesis and things of that nature. And then on the other end, the far end of the spectrum, are the trance channelers, the ones who allow themselves to have their body and person taken over by some entity that then speaks through them as this other individual or entity. She sees that again as a spectrum. And I like that usage of it, because of what it recognizes is that we all, to a degree, are channelers. We all have those gut hunches and the intuitive knowingness, whether we move up into the realm of ESP and doing trance channeling. She says that we have access to doing all of these, and there's ways that we can teach ourselves techniques for growing our awareness of it. Now, one of the reasons that I think this is important to outline this spectrum of channeling, not only because it now allows us to see that we too are channelers, or can be even channeling more at a greater, higher level, is that it gets to what do we actually mean by channeling and how do we define channeling. And one of the things that Wahbeh says in her books and in her talks online is that channeling is really that sense of getting an information that comes from beyond our normal experience of time and space. When we think that the information comes beyond the physical, i.e. comes from some metaphysical aspect. Now, however you wish to describe that, it's the sense that there's information that we can get by logic and science and observation, all coming from the physical realm of life. But if information comes to us from a non-physical, non-material aspect of life, an aspect of life that transcends the world of form, time, and space, that information can be considered channeled information. And that's where intuition comes from, and that's where gut hunches come from, and that's where ESP and those techniques and trance channeling all come from. Now, one insight that I had in thinking about channeling and New Thought was that many New Thought writers probably at some point channeled information. I know that when I've written my books, or I write my blogs, or any of the writing that I do, there is sometimes that I step aside from this physical realm and there's information that comes through me. I've had that experience many, many times, and it reaffirms for me the fact that there's a non-physical aspect to life and that this information comes from some source or beyond that, I can choose to label it in some form or fashion, but I know that it's non-material. And when I look back at a lot of the writings of New Thought teachers through the last 130 or so years, there's many of them that I think certainly read as if they were channeled. Specifically, I'm thinking some of the works of William Walker Atkinson, who wrote The Kabbalion under the name Three Initiates. Atkinson also wrote a lot of books under the name Swami Ramatakaraka, where he taught Eastern teachings as this other entity. Now, I've always felt like he used these other names as a marketing hook to sell the book, the very nature that you want to put it under the name of something mysterious, gave it a little heft for the potential purchaser of the book. But I think also when you read some of his words, you have no doubt that a lot of that information, he was truly in the flow in the way that he presented it. And some of it was information that you thought, how did he know this? The same thing comes up for me as a student and researcher working a lot with the works of New Thought teacher Ernest Holmes, is that there are many of the works of Holmes that I read them, or passages of certain books, where it certainly reads like he was definitely in the flow in the presentation or the writing of those words. I've listened to hundreds of hours of audio of Ernest Holmes as well, and many times I can feel him being in that sense of some sort of spiritual flow or essence where the words are coming through him, and they're not really sourced by Ernest, but rather he is a conduit for those words to come through him. I know in my own works, in terms of talking in front of groups, there is plenty of times that I have presented things or said things where I had sort of had to stop and wonder, where did that come from? And I could certainly feel that I was in that flow state where information was coming from beyond me. So a lot of times the source of information in New Thought has sort of a non-material source. Now, even beyond that, let's look at the philosophy of New Thought. New Thought teaches that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. In that is implied that we live on multiple realms at the same time. We have a spiritual truth that transcends the world of form, but we're also living in the world of form. And so implicit in that is the aspect that since we're living in multiple realms and that everything is one, that the non-physical and the physical are interbound in an interconnectedness of oneness. Hence, here we are on the material physical plane looking for information, and that information can come to us from non-physical sources. So that's why I think so many people in New Thought are open to channeling, because they recognize already that we are open to information flowing to us from beyond time and space. With this interconnectedness of the spiritual, the mental, and the physical intertwined in a oneness taught by New Thought, it says we can reach into the realms beyond the material for information, and we can do that through prayer, through listening to our intuition, through being in a meditative state and allowing our meditations to allow information to come through us. I know this is another experience that I've had many, many times of sitting on the meditation cushion and information just downloads come to me. Much of my writings have come that way, where I get the idea for the writing in some sort of download where I don't know where it comes from. New Thought says that we can tap into an intuitive knowingness that transcends the world of form for information. In fact, New Thought also in many communities teaches a practice called visioning. Visioning is simply a process where we recognize that there is divine intelligence in the realm of the non-physical that we can bring into an awareness in the state of the physical. And the process of visioning, which I've got a video on, and I'll link that in the show description below, on how to do visioning, and it gives you an example of one. In visioning, we simply go into a meditative state, tie ourselves into a sense consciously of the inner oneness of all that is, and then ask questions. Ask questions and then listen for the information to come about. Another way in which New Thought, and specifically Ernest Holmes, relates to channeling gets at something that he stressed in his 1938 Science of Mind textbook, which is to distinguish between intuitive wisdom and psychic information. Let me read a quote from Ernest. A mystic is one who senses the divine presence. Some people confuse mysticism with psychism, and it's important that we make a clear distinction. A mystic is one who intuitively senses reality, note the capital R there, the highest and best that we have in civilization, music, art, religion, philosophy, poetry, science, etc., is the result of the mystic sense which has been perceived by a few in each age. The psychic capacity, at best, deals only with human thought, only reads subjective pictures and tendencies. A mystic does not read human thought, but senses the thought of God. He goes on to define intuition this way. Intuition is an inner awareness of spiritual truths without conscious process of thought. Intuitional realization is realization arrived at without processes of reasoning. Interior awareness without any argument. Now, what we can see in those things is that Ernest is encouraging us to tap into and recognize the wisdom that comes through intuition. That when we are using our intuition, we are tapping into spiritual or divine intelligence, but that we also have to practice discernment on the information that comes through from non-physical realities. That's why he makes the distinction between intuitive knowing and psychic knowing. Intuitive knowing or mystical knowing is tapping into those divine truths that come from the realm of spirit. Whereas psychic information, which can be useful, comes from the non-physical, from a realm beyond this world of time and space, but it comes through a realm of collective consciousness of human thinking. And so certain individuals are open or receptive to tapping into psychic information. But that psychic information, Ernest warns us, may be tainted by the limitations of the human thought that was thought into the collective consciousness and which we're now tapping into. and it has a different level of truth to it than the greater truth that comes from spirit. So, back to Ms. Wahbeh's spectrum, we can look at some of the ESP experiences or telepathy or things of that nature where one aspect of one mind seems to be maybe reading the aspects of other minds or the collective consciousness, but it may be tapping into sort of a human-tainted level of awareness where information may be not as totally accurate as that which comes from either higher realms of spirit. And so we, as individuals who are tapping into any wisdom that comes from beyond the physical, needs to employ those skills of discernment that I talked about at the beginning of this video so that we can discern what is valid and what's not valid, whether it resonates with us as truth or not. Okay? So we must continuously be open to the fact that there's spiritual truth and there's psychic information, and to discern between the two, and that sometimes psychic information can be useful to us. Now, one other thing that Ernest talked about, and many other people have as well, is that when we're trying to use psychic information for, say, projecting out into the future where things are headed, that psychic information can show the general pattern or direction of the collective consciousness. But he often equates it to like shooting an arrow. When we shoot an arrow, assuming nothing interrupts that arrow, we can project its trajectory and where the arrow is going to hit. But there's always the possibility that something could intervene in the direction of the arrow and changing its path. And so psychic information is much like that. It sees a tendency or direction, but it doesn't necessarily see the end result. It's seeing where it's headed, subject to no change. Just like we can say that we can look out at psychically and look at the world and say we can see where it's headed in a general direction, and if nothing changes, this is where it's going to go. But that always leaves open the possibility that something could intervene and redirect and change the outcome. And though that intervention in much of New Thought teaching is intervening with new thoughts, intervening with new consciousness or new awarenesses that allows us to change the trajectory from where things are headed in the material world to a new outcome with the introduction of a new insight through our own thinking. So hopefully you can see there's a lot of interplay between New Thought and channeling if we look at it as tapping wisdom beyond the physical material world and gaining access to that wisdom. But one of the questions that always comes up to people is, when I get this information, how do I know it's real? How do I know it's real? I had so many people in classes when we've taught visioning say, how do I know that the information who's coming through me in the visioning session is really, truly from beyond me and is not simply my ego projecting what I want to say in this moment in answer to this particular question? And that is a question. That is a question that we all have to answer whenever we're tapping into and listening to guidance from beyond the physical. Is it an interplay of what we already want to happen that's being interjected into the conversation? And my answer to that is that, yes, there's always that possibility, but over time you will learn to discern when you open yourself to more and more allowing stuff to come through you and recognizing when that information comes through you came from beyond you. You will recognize there are greater truths that can come through you. And it's not coming from your own ego and your own personality desiring to give yourself information to guide you that's in the direction that you already wanted to go. And that same discernment that you can apply to your own inner knowing of what you're receiving and whether it's valid as truly transcendent information is the same discernment that you can apply when you're looking at psychic information or information that's being provided by ESP or by trance channelers. So any channeled information, any information, whether it's coming through you or through other individuals, individualized expressions of the one, that you need to apply discernment to it and say, is this really true? Does it make sense for me? I know I've said that several times, but I can't overstress it, that you must apply discernment to the information that's coming through until you can build up that recognition of when you're truly getting truth and when you're getting BS. So finally, if we can all channel, and we all are channelers, how can we tap into and actually channel information? Well, Wahbeh teaches some concepts that I think are very much in alignment with New Thought. And she says that you can enhance your ability to channel by first setting an intention to channel. Very basic concept of New Thought is that anything that we want to create, we begin with an intention. So if you wish to bring more channeled information into your life, start with setting the intention that I would like to access more channeled information. And even be specific about that. Is it through your own self channeling information, or is it through information being provided by people who appear to be other than you? Okay. But assuming that we're talking about information coming through you and being able to recognize channel information, first set the intention. Secondly, she suggests, and again, a concept that's very much just a part of New Thought, is the more you believe it, the more you're going to see it. Again, that's something New Thought teaches so much. You'll see it when you believe it, is a phrase we've all heard. And so if you can truly set your intention and then have a belief that channeled information, that intuition, or whatever thing that you're wishing to have come through you is going to come through you, that belief is going to contribute to the reality of it manifesting here in the world of form. The next thing is to enter into a meditative state. Why would we do that? Because it's in meditation that we set aside the busyness and our attractedness and our being overwhelmed with sensory input of the physical world, so that we can go inward and tap into information that may be beyond the physical world. As long as our focus and attention is on the material world, that's what we're going to see. This is why meditation is so important. Meditation turns us inward and into a recognition of energies and powers and intelligence that transcends the world of the physical. Meditation calms the material monkey mind and allows us to tap into things that are beyond time and space. And by definition, we could call that channeled information. So meditation puts you in the space to be receiving it. And then finally, be open. Be open and non-judgmental about the information coming through you. Be open to receiving whatever it is and making note of it. One easy way to do this in Wahbeh's teaching is that you can, again, set the intention, believe that it's going to work, go into a meditative state, and she suggests asking one simple question with a yes or no answer, and just sitting in silence until you feel like which way to go. If you've never done visioning before, or you're not ever had the experience of trying to tap into knowledge and wisdom consciously beyond the world of form, this is a good way to start, because it's like using a Ouija board and wanting to go yes or no. You're simply trying to say, is there information beyond me that can give me guidance in feeling one way or the other? And if you can let go of the material world and all its expectations and all your own expectations about the question that you're asking, and just simply give into it and know that the answer will come through you, then you will find that you can get a feeling as to which way, if it's a yes or a no. And from the energy and experience that you gain from doing that process, you can go even further to take it into even more questioning and listening to more guidance. My invitation to you is to take this information to heart, look at the world around you, and look at where you get your information. Yes, we get a lot from the material world, physical experiences, things of rational thought, but there's all the time experiences where you're being given information that transcend the rational, that transcend time and space and the material world. And look at the wisdom that's coming to you, and apply discernment, as we've talked about in this video, but to be open to it coming to you, and then trust it and use it and try it and see if it works for you. I hope this has been interesting, given you food for thought, and gives you something to practice. I would appreciate your feedback if you've got any, but thanks for watching.